Taavi, thank you for joining me for a chat again. Today, I really want to find out more about you, really. I do know you, but we can always go into more detail, and I'm sure everyone else would like to hear how you came to where you are now in Salv. But the thing that really interests me about your career is that it's quite unique. I think you talked to me before about being, maths is your background, not to put words in your mouth, but how did you go from math nerd to fraud fighter?
Yeah, thanks. It's great to share my story. It was quite exciting times during my university. I was doing my master thesis in probability theory and mathematics, and later on it converted into the PhD studies of machine learning back in 2007 and so on. So I'm a PhD dropout as a proper startupper, but yeah, I was doing math and then machine learning during 2005-ish. Skype, which was European first unicorn, and then Skype's technology headquarters was in Estonia, in Tallinn, and all these geniuses who built the infrastructure and all the UIs and everything for Skype. And when they launched a paid service, was paid calls from Skype network to landline and mobiles, they discovered that there was credit card payments enabled, and the fraud wave hit them really hard, and they were funded by the VCs, and the big part of the money that they got as funding was burnt or was allocated to fraudsters. And at some point of time, they said that the money that they lost to the fraud was about they could rent Boeing 767 and constantly drive around the world for that money. Skype almost went into bankruptcy, or the Visa and MasterCard threatened them to close the card payments because they exceeded this 1% threshold of the chargebacks. And back then, basically, Skype started to build an anti-fraud team into Tallinn office, and I was reached out by some people I knew that you have been learning mathematics and statistics, and we have pretty large amount of data in Skype databases. To think about tens of millions of people making calls and payments and transactions every day. So there was a huge data problem, and the loss of each single fraud case was super small. It was €10 worth of credit purchases, but actually fraudsters already back then were able to automate their processes. So I joined as a data analyst into the fraud team, and initially I said no, that I don't want to join. It's super boring. I didn't know anything about fraud, and I thought it's super boring just to build some statistical models for some strange corner cases. But luckily, they were chasing me for several months in a row, and until I went into interviews and I saw the great office full of young and energized people and full of bean bags and free cookies and Coca-Cola. And luckily I said yes, I'm joining. And then I worked with big data, which wasn't the term back then, but data was really huge actually. That was analyzing and processing and building models and making decisions. So that was my first intro. One of the aha moments, which I'm thinking back, was that actually there was a company called Ethoca, and they're still working well, and the Canadian founders, I know them also in these days. But actually Ethoca offered FinCrime intelligence exchange between the bank and merchants, where the bank's customer who was defrauded submitted a claim to the bank. It wasn't yet official chargeback, because official chargeback submission and processing, it took 3-4 months actually. So there wasn't any indication of the actual fraud happening between the bank and e-commerce provider before this 3 months period was over and the official chargeback was received. But actually, as soon as the information was submitted by the victim to the bank, Ethoca was engaged, and they delivered a message about this high fraud suspicion to the e-commerce merchant. And even if the money was gone, actually, it wasn't gone always from the merchant, but at least the signal was received very quickly, and it was possible to learn from these fraud patterns really quickly. And actually it helped me to build way better models thanks to this information exchange, which was happening about highly suspicious, not yet officially confirmed fraud. And again, of course, we used many different methods as well, but back then I concluded that successful fraud fighting requires data which is gathered by the internal systems, but also we desperately need data from other institutions, and that's what Ethoca provided us. Now, moving on to the next stage of my career, it was Wise, TransferWise, and I joined as head of compliance. I was employee number 40 or something, and I knew that also Wise was like really cool Estonians founded company, and I didn't apply for this job, but I was again invited to join the team by some ex-colleagues with whom I worked together at Skype. They had moved into Wise, and they knew that okay, Taavi can do some things, and I was pulled in, and I was like, yeah, it's a Wise, super cool company. But when I landed there, I really didn't know what to do. I was sitting there and I was reading UK regulations for the payment service providers, and I was reading their internal compliance policies and procedures, and then we had to expand into Australia and into Canada, and then I had to read these legislations. I thought, like, what the heck I'm doing here? I'm a mathematician. I'm reading some strange compliance regulations, AML regulations. I landed in a completely wrong place. But again, somehow got myself together, and it became more interesting when I saw some events happening, or some like high risk transactions happening, or some operational data. Because like in the beginning, company was so small that there was no fraud, there was no money laundering attempts, no sanction hits, nothing. It was just policies and procedures and like super boring KYC procedures. But actually, over the time when we grew, then actually that actors started to discover us as a potential way to launder money and to defraud people, and then became more interesting and more operational fight against the crime again for me. And again, like one of the interesting moments for me was like, I think it was 2016 or something, where I discovered that like some people were hit by the APP scam actually back then. I think the case was that some retired people in Sweden, some other people from Turkey were trying to sell them new furniture, and basically people in Sweden, they thought that they're making payments into the Swedish company to buy the furniture, but actually this Swedish company's accounts were controlled by the criminals who delivered this money immediately to some Turkish IBANs and withdraw the money. And the Swedish people were waiting for this furniture forever, right? And then I saw that, okay, like we're not able to detect those cases too well, but also there was no way to compensate to these people because the legal regime was missing. And then it was like flashback to like 10 years earlier when I remember that, okay, I can't take over money muling. So the history started to repeat itself for me. And some years later, when of course we expanded into new countries and new fraud models evolved, then actually it wasn't me to be honest, but like one of the colleagues, he defined a famous project or vision which he called the poolside margarita, which the idea was that actually when the fraud team saw that some stolen credentials, stolen money went into other institutions, like into the banks in US, they wanted to contact with these fraud people in the other institutions, and they searched for phone numbers, and they made calls to these people in the States, and they were trying to call to these people and warn that, come on, hey, like there was some stolen money from Wise's customer and that landed in your accounts, and can you please suspend the account and investigate. And the reaction was that the people who received those calls, and when they realized that there's like some important but super discreet information coming in, they physically dropped the call, hang it up, and they said that we're not speaking with you anymore. And that was like the bullseye margarita plan, was that actually if we can connect and build the trust and build the connections between the people and banks and institutions to transfer this kind of critical information about financial crime, then we can all sit back and relax, and actually all the fraud is gone. Fortunately or unfortunately, this project was never actually established on the global scale. But ultimately now that brings me to the today's world where I'm right now, which is ultimately the whole PSR in the European Union, PSR like Article 83, so then the MLR Article 75, so Salv bridge we can call it under the code name Poolside Margarita right now, because that's exactly what we were dreaming back 10 years ago, but what's happening right now, and I'm super happy to go into details with that.
I guess then that kind of answers the question of like, mathematician and thinking about things like, probability, LLMs and whatnot. They're not necessarily common prerequisite for for being an entrepreneur, starting a business. Is it a case then that with this experience in your back pocket and seeing how history was repeating itself, was it a case of you went and built Salv to give you the tools that you wish you'd had when you were working in Wise and when you were working in Skype? Was it a case of taking that experience and building the product that you know is needed in those environments?
in Wise actually, where it was a hugely mission-driven company, and we had lots of challenges. But Wise wasn't like fraud fighting company. It wasn't like AML and Regtech company. It was like serving people who wanted to send money across the borders and like to cut the costs, making it so easy and comfortable for people. And I felt that if I need to build fraud products and AML products and KYC and onboarding products in-house, of course I need to do it to optimize and speed up. But actually I'm wasting companies' money. Instead, these super smart people, they should be focused on building the core value for the end customers, not to deal with this kind of secondary or third level problems, which we still had, and I think they still have. And in today's Wise, I think they have whatever 1,000+ people working on the field that I was running back then alone, or with some close colleagues. But I felt really sorry that actually I had to spend the resource, tech engineering and ops resource for that. And then when I left Wise, and that was like definitely one of the triggers for me, is like, okay, I have a bit of knowledge about like how to fight financial crime. Like how can I help other companies, other financial institutions not to overspend their internal resource on these things which are not their core focus and not their core bread and butter. And that was like I put myself back into my shoes, like where I was like a data scientist, data analyst, and I was thinking, okay, what kind of tools I was missing, or like what kind of skills I was missing, or what kind of internal product developments I was leading, and basically taking this knowledge and rebuilding it for tens and hundreds of other companies who might not have this luxury to have so much resource available in-house. So that was definitely one driver for me. And the other is like when I was thinking further, like what are the real components that crime fighting systems need to have? Purely, for me, it comes down to three simple things. Like you need data, in-house data, but also data points from other institutions, like which you can rely on. You cannot have the high number of false positive data points, but actually you need to have like rather less and true positive data points. A large Excel table which is built based on your own customers, the transactions, but also from data that you have received. It has to be fresh. It has to be accessible to you. It has to be unobfuscated. That's like really tough thing to offer. Actually, it sounds easy, but actually in most of financial institutions, crime fighters do not have access to the raw or non-raw data in real time. In some institutions, they see obfuscated data on the next day after everything has happened. The second component that institutions are missing is actually the ability to make smart decisions based on this data. So basically rules. You mentioned about LLMs are like, it doesn't really matter if these rules or decisions are based on the human intelligence or machine intelligence. You need everything, of course. But again, like learning from your own mistakes and successes, learning from others, training your models, getting AI to train your models, getting hints, learning together with other institutions around you. So that's like huge second component, which is like how to make decisions based on the data. And the third is actually when you have this rule engine, as we call it, in place, then you need to take some actions. And what are these actions? How, like suspending the payment in real time. You also need to have like data available in real time and rules running in real time. Then you can take actions also in real time. Suspending payments, suspending accounts, submitting extra questions to your customers close to real time, but also getting your peers in other financial institutions to take some actions. Again, like how do you, if the money is gone already from your accounts, then it still might be there on the second or third financial institutions. And how can you take actions together with them, or how can you ask them to take some actions, like to suspend the payments? And again, if it's true positive, then returning the money and maybe submitting, if it's AML, then submitting suspicious activity reports together. So this is like the actions layer. And if I'm thinking in the structural ways, like data, rules, and actions, then it's like in different parts of this flow I can involve, and I can help companies with my products, which they definitely need. And that has been driving my innovation throughout the journey, actually.
You've nailed something there for me, which is around this idea of like when financial institutions are making the decision of, do you build this in-house, or do you seek a solution? Do you find a tool? And I think we're in a high trust environment that requires an awful lot of cooperation. So the tools that you bring in are tools to serve the decision makers in-house. So, your head of fraud, your investigators, whoever it is in-house that's making those decisions, they need to have the access to the best, most reliable tools. and a way to communicate the disparate parts of information and give themselves the most accurate full picture of what's going on. Because obviously from a criminal perspective, they know what's going on. They've orchestrated this. They understand how all those parts are put together, and we are always on the back foot. But bad intelligence or, incorrect tooling or immature tooling, I guess, it's not necessarily that it's bad, but it just hasn't come from experience, can really be quite damaging in that battle against kind of fraudster and financial institution. So I guess with that in mind, I'd really like to hear about how, now we know your background a little bit and what you brought into Salv, but can we talk a little bit maybe specifically about the Bridge platform and the role that rolling it out in Estonia had to play? What did you learn from your early pilots? So not necessarily where you are now, but what it was like in the beginning and what you learned from it and how the technology and community model has evolved through the pilot that you did in Estonia.
Yeah, it was one thing you said about your previous conclusion was that like build versus buy thing, which again, like 5-ish years ago, there was like MasterCard. MasterCard has a wonderful lighthouse program for the startups in the Scandinavia and Baltics, and to connect these startups with the large banks and with the card providers. And we were part of the program, and like through this innovative discussions, we figured out that okay, there are like some large banks who kind of they're pretty good with their, okay, not too good, but still they're quite happy actually with their own internal AML and fraud monitoring systems, but they kind of lack the signals of true positives, or like to learn and to train their internal people and models. Like they are both focusing only on their own models and their own learnings, and they're even shy to share these learnings with others because they're afraid that they sound immature, or they give the impression to their colleagues that they don't know what they're doing. There's like a psychologically interesting aspect that like all the banks we were speaking with, there wasn't about technical or legal limitations. Of course, these were also there, but the main limitation was that they were afraid that they don't look too smart if they send their low level of learnings. And then that was like one trigger for us to start thinking, how can we help them to learn together? And in parallel, actually in UK, in London, FCA organized hackathon to get banks and lawyers and technology people together to build some sort of intelligence sharing concept. So they were happening in parallel, basically. Nordics, Baltics led by the MasterCard, and then in UK led by the FCA. And I realized that, okay, there is something in that space. And then I remembered the old experience with like Skype and Rechtech, and also the Wise's Bullseye Margarita dream. And then we came back from these hackathons and events, and we engaged with like some banks who were close to us. We had already our previous products out there in the market, and then like banks knew us pretty well, even if so often didn't use our sanction screening and monitoring products back then. And then we just connected to the two largest banks and said that okay, let's sit down and have this kind of series of discussions, like what are you missing, or what kind of knowledge and information you would like to receive from other institutions around you. And luckily, as soon as I started speaking with two largest banks, then actually the next two, like third and fourth one, they also said that hey, please involve us as well in this discussion. So it was like very surprising to see that right after the first peer was formed, which was hard, then there was like very quickly other institutions realized that okay, we want to be part of this game, and we limited it with 4. Although all the other banks also wanted to join the initial piloting. Then we actually like built a very structured framework of the for the project. Basically, we split the initiative into the technical work, like what kind of technology is needed to exchange the information in reliable and secure and compliant way. Then we created a legal, like a focus group or task force, a working group actually, with the banks and with the lawyers, case lawyers and data protection inspectorate and FIU and FCA in Estonia. That's the beauty of the small countries, that actually is like so trivial to get the like head of local data protection inspectorate to be part of these working groups, because we clearly saw that private sector was super afraid of doing anything without data protection. And of course, last but not least, the most important was actually the working group around actual use cases, where like what's the actual business value, assuming that we resolve the tech part and we resolve the legal complaints part. And it was like these work streams or the working groups worked in parallel. Of course, like, there was like governance, organization, and everything. And we spent about like 3 months to figure out everything, how they need to work together. Like we had 15 different use cases and 15 different user stories around data sharing, coming from the validated PEP lists and suspicious entity sharing and like fraud and AML and everything. So it was super. We still have these cases documented. And then we actually did a voting or like agreement with the members, like, okay, which are the most important and the most useful ones for them. I think the first establishment, like research and building the first prototype and getting it into live usage, it took maybe 1 year. And this 1 year was like the initial onboarding and everything happened. And once this first year was over, then actually everyone who were part of the initial project, plus the ones who were not part of the initial project, they actually became real commercial contracts for us. And ever since then, which is like 3.5 years ago already, we have been serving them. We have been adding more use cases that were like mapped out to the beginning. We have been adding a cross-border exchange with other countries around us. We have pulled in public sector authorities, different parts of the public sector. They want to share information and get information back from the banks. We have been organizing community events, which is like hugely important. It's not only about product and tech, it's about people who need to trust each other. So we have been helping them to come up with rule books, memorandums, internal policies and procedures, reporting, audits. So it's like whole universe that's needed actually to run these things properly. And tech in itself is like maybe 5% of the 10% of the whole effort that went in there. So.
It's really interesting to get behind the scenes in the process of how you've done that, particularly within Estonia. And like you say, you can think that it's just, bring the financial institutions together, but actually the government, the public, private sectors, like, they become so important. There's way more key stakeholders in this, I guess, than maybe you would have thought at the beginning. One thing about Estonia, though, is it's often very much celebrated as a digital society with e-residency, a lot of interoperability across platforms, and a real culture of tech innovation. When it comes to kind of finance and data protection, especially when it comes to cross-border, any sort of cross-border activities, what was some of the biggest lessons that you learned, like legal or regulatory hurdles that you maybe encountered when building a bridge across institutions that go across Europe and the UK rather than staying within Estonia itself? You know, what lessons did you learn in branching out, I guess?
After launching in Estonia 4 years ago, and we have launched also a similar network in Latvia with slightly different use cases, but now they're merging together. We have launched the product, or we have pulled companies into the network also from Poland, from Lithuania, from UK, from many other countries in Europe. And one thing I've learned, or I've concluded, that there are no shortcuts when working with the financial institutions. They all, regardless of their location, care very much about their privacy, customers' privacy, security of data, compliance. In every country, when I speak with the banking associations, top bankers or fintechs, they are trying to convince me that they are so special, they are super difficult. It's very hard to launch anything like that in their country. And I'm polite and I'm listening to them, of course. But in real life, it's as hard as in every other country, because every country thinks that they're unique, which is actually, for me as a consumer of the financial institutions, like super building a confidence that they are not taking these things easily at all. It doesn't matter in which country you are. Basically, learning from Estonia was that actually, although I thought that it's like a digital nation and like tech savvy, and we have all this digital wallets and everything, so it should be kind of easier. It wasn't, because these are like, again, all the financial institutions are following the hardest regulations of the Europe and like some countries, and they are not willing to take any risk, especially in old days when it was like it wasn't mandatory to be part of these networks. It was just like optional. Maybe that's the only thing, the optional things that banks are doing, is that they're sharing data. If you think about KYC procedures, onboarding, EDD, CDD, AML, monitoring controls, everything, they're predominantly doing it because it's mandatory. Like they're not doing because it helps anyone. Of course, it helps some people as well, but they're predominantly doing because it's needed. But now they are taking huge extra risk by implementing something new, which wasn't mandatory back then, sorry. And but actually 3 years later, when I'm speaking with the chief risk officers of these institutions, they're saying that, Taavi, it was hard to launch, of course, but now the breaches are part of our life critical functions and services. And I cannot imagine how banks without the ability to exchange RFIs about scam fraud or RFIs about sanction hits, how they can exist. And that's the biggest compliment for me, is like, yes, it's hard to launch, but actually if it turns out to be like a life critical service for the institutions, then actually we're doing something great, and like there is no need to change drastically any of the approach. But now looking forward, actually, when I said that in the first country and in Estonia it was like obligatory to launch it, in the second country already in Latvia, their use case was was mandatory, and also like in the next countries where we're launching, especially now across the European Union, the payment service regulation based on the current wording says that financial institutions or payment service providers shall connect to their domestic and international networks. And by law, this shall, as I just learned, is like must, and that makes decisions also for the people way easier. Again, the implementation is still harder, but at least decision, they understand that, okay, it's like falls into the same basket with I shall do the KYC, and I shall do the risk-based approach, and I shall do the AML monitoring. Now I shall connect also with the networks, network providers. Again, back to the beginning, it's like that's where the trust really matters. And like I see it where the people and the institutions, they trust, on one hand, they trust the people that they know and they have been working together, but also they want to see that there's like evidence or like the proven track record over the years that this company has done something in real life, has been serving institutions who have been audited many times. This servicing model still works really well and grows. This is like the industry evidence, or that also matters a lot. It's not only about the personal connections and personal trust, which is also mandatory, of course, but that's not enough.
I think that it's a really strong point, that is the importance of a track record, which is obviously so difficult when you're kind of stepping on new ground. You know, growth and kind of responding to threats is always painful. It's always tricky when you're the expedition leaders and you're the first to have done it. And, you know, it's nice for me to see and to be able to kind of applaud Salv in doing that in Estonia, but also the institutions that did it with you and that came together. And surely in my mind that makes it much easier. I know you said that every country or institution thinks it's a special case. You know, rightly so, like you said, it means that they are giving it the due diligence that it needs. But it surely does make it easier when it's now not just a shall, but that unheard must do. It allows us to go into these endeavours in financial institutions with a level of safety. And when we're dealing with risk all the time, you know, we want to do anything to minimise that risk. So having that kind of proven track record is really valuable, I think. But one of the things that struck me in this conversation, Taavi, is that repetition of how the same challenges come up in different institutions, moving from Skype to Wise, but also from different jurisdiction, moving from Estonia to Latvia to other European countries and beyond. We know that financial crime isn't just technical, and you've alluded to that with the building of personal relationships, but as well as communities and trust. You know, we've got to elevate everything together, as you said. But is it tied to issues like trafficking, sanctions, war, and geopolitical shifts? And the current environment we're in, we're probably at a more uncertain time than ever. How do you see the role of Regtech evolving in the next 5 to 10 years to actually change systemic outcomes? When you're looking forward now, how do you see Salv's role in what we've got facing us now and into the future?
In the current environment or current legal environment, actually, all the liability, like almost all the liability, was relying on the victims. Like if you speak about scam fraud, or if you speak about money laundering, then of course banks have some liability, but actually people or companies whose money is being laundered, they are never getting it back, so they're also like direct victims, right? But now the shift is happening in the regulatory space that there is more liability put on the financial institutions who are regulated. It can be wrong, it can be right, but that's the change which is happening, right? Like mandatory reimbursement thing which is happening. That's a classical evidence, but it seems that if these kind of large scandals and dramas are happening, then governments are being forced by the publicity to put more liability on the financial institutions. And from that level, it's interesting that like Regtechs or like the technology companies, advisors like yourselves as well, are like almost forgotten by the governments. Again, not sure is it good or bad, but we're like helping financial institutions as much as we can. But now it kind of seems, or like at least there are some signals, early signals that that's also going to change, and there's like more formal and informal liability rights given also to the supporters, the service providers, technology providers like ourselves. Like a few signals is like, as I said, like according to PSR and the AMLR, actually, they're both saying that, yeah, like banks and regulated entities and payment service providers need to connect with each other, but they're also calling out those network providers or like the service providers or infrastructure providers. And it seems that the regulators are putting more hope on us right now. Like from EU regulatory space, at least this kind of our role is being called out as infrastructure providers for FinCrime data exchange. So that's coming from the regulators side, and I've got the vision that actually there's like more and more regulator framework created also for us. I think it's good because like financial institutions are looking at us and they don't understand what we're doing if we're not regulated, because if they're regulated heavily, they want to match their regulator expectations with other regulated entities, which can be Regtech providers. Now, when I'm thinking, that's like one side is like becoming more regulated as Regtechs. The other part is that actually from technology point of view, I think someone said that like 1,000 plus Regtech companies around the world. So it's not only about AML monitoring or sanction screening, it's like broader scope of the Regtechs, which is huge number, right? And like there is no room for all of us. Again, vibe coding coming in, different AI tools, like it becomes easier and easier to build like in-house training software for my stuff, or like a super fancy risk assessment product or tool for myself. But where I see my future and Salv future is that like actually we're becoming more and more like an infrastructure provider, and like when going into this intelligence sharing, data sharing space, there is a heavy need for the standardized infrastructure. It's like cell phone calls, like GSM network is a standard. Like Swift for processing international payments, there is Swift network, or in EU there is a SEPA like standards in place, and someone is running and hosting all of that. And like we are clearly taking the role right now, like to be this GSM network for the FinCrime teams across the Europe initially and across the world as well. And if we do that well, and again, I am not saying that we will be the only ones, but there is no room for thousands of these kind of providers. Like we need to work together. We're like looking to connect with many other similar infrastructure which are not explicitly meant for the FinCrime data exchange, but still which can be used. Like there are like two examples. Like one is the national security. They were like certs, basically. Cert institutions there are using usually the MISP system, which is like open source software for gathering like fraudulent, like known criminal IP addresses and then some websites and URLs. And these MISP systems are like up to some level used also for the FinCrime data sharing. So like, and they're like semi-part of the infrastructure that we need to connect with, and we're connecting already. And the other direction is actually, if we're looking into the payments and like money movements space, as I mentioned, Swift and SEPA, again, which are not today, they're not meant for exchanging information about FinCrime. They're meant to exchange information and deliver the payments. But actually integrating with those through the standards like ISO 222 and stuff, that's again something where we're heading to. So the infrastructure will be able to connect with other pieces of the infrastructure around us. So that's our future for the next 5 or 10 years, actually.
Yeah, it makes an awful lot of sense in terms of where things are going, both from a regulatory point of view, but also from that criminal perspective. We've long talked about how easy it is for criminals to cut to the chase and talk to each other and whatnot. And if Encro taught us anything, it's that criminals need infrastructure to communicate as well. And that actually those networks can live and die on how well they're able to exchange that data and communicate with each other in safe ways. And obviously, thankfully for us, law enforcement were able to break that system. The key thing is that we need that reliable, trustworthy infrastructure within our financial services and beyond to be able to do that on the other side and do it better than them. So I think everything that you've said, I can see how you've moved from kind of not, what did you say, dropout PhD in the beginning, which thank God you did, Taavi, because I think from one academic to another, you've made such a real world impact in everything that you've done, in the positions that you've had, that as much as I would like to say we do that with our PhDs, I don't think we do. so thank God we have got you in industry, and to see your progression both within industry and right through, and how that shines through in Salv is really interesting to hear, but also very admirable. So thank you for sharing your story with me today, and I look forward to catching up again soon about more topics in financial crime and how we're going to prevent it.
Thank you. And just one last thought that you reminded to me is the gap between the criminals and the crime fighters. Many people have been asking from me is who don't know this industry too well, they have been asking from me is how do you stay ahead of the crime, or how can you be sure that you're more innovative and faster than criminals? And usually I'm saying that I'm sorry to say that, but still criminals are ahead of the crime fighters actually. And my job is to reduce the gap, or get closer to the criminals. It's not vice versa. If we're getting closer to criminals by, again, learning from them what they're doing well, and actually mimicking that even this helps us actually in this fight. But yeah, I'm super excited to see the future of our industry, because I've been saying that it's there is a really dogmatic shift in the crime fighters world, which we see once in every decade, and this intelligence sharing approach, legal basis technology best practices, this is the change of this decade, and that's I'm super happy to drive it together with many smart people around us. So that's really exciting time for me in this journey.